A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerechtbare Brüder in Amerika, so tausend Schabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda
Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been sponsored by OU's Teach Coalition, who is encouraging everyone to go out and vote in the upcoming elections next week, November 8th, 2022, the midterms elections, governor elections, turning out in all the states, a close election. And OU's Teach Coalition and its network of thousands of activists just like you are urging everyone to go out and vote. I just want to elaborate on that point a second. Like I said, there can be a few episodes of me examining the Jewish story in the United States, of pushing frontiers on the American landscape. And this current episode will discuss immigration, which I've touched on in several different episodes in the past. And for many who arrived during the time of immigration, they arrived in New York Harbor and were greeted, as is well known, by the Statue of Liberty, and as is well known to every school child, on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty is a poem by a Jewish poetess, Emma Lazarus, called The New Colossus. And just to quote a few lines, which I'm sure are familiar to most people, but just for another reminder, I'm just excerpting a couple of lines from that poem. Not going to trouble you with the whole thing, obviously. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. And then later on, she says a very famous line, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," and so on and so on. And she wrote it on November 2nd, 1883. This is the early years of the Great Immigration. No one at the time could imagine how many millions of huddled masses would arrive until the United States, of course, decided to shut its doors in 1924. But the freedom that the Jewish arrivals, the Jewish huddled masses they achieved by arriving in the country during that time was the freedom to practice their religion, the freedom to practice business, the freedom to have their education, which they didn't utilize the freedom right away, but they eventually did. And the way to preserve that freedom was by exercising their right in the democratic process by voting. And they did not, that generation of the immigrants, and possibly their children as well, they didn't take it for granted. And neither should we. That's the tendency to sometimes take things for granted, but neither should we. And it's not enough for the great community of listeners of Jewish History Soundbites to vote. It's important for everyone to encourage others as well within everyone's social circles and communities to raise awareness. And it's not important who one votes for as long as you vote. And for help, contact the voter hotline of OU's Teach Coalition at 646-459-5162. And you can see them online at teachcoalition.org/vote. Today, like I started speaking about, I'm going to speak about the Great Immigration. The Great Immigration is the immigration of millions of Jews, 2.5 million Jews approximately. Of course, the numbers are debatable. Between the years 1880, 81, until 1924. 1924 is the end of the Great Immigration simply because the United States Congress passes a law that curtails it, and it doesn't exactly start in 1881. Just that's when it becomes greater. It probably starts in the 1870s already. There's not an exact year that we can say is the beginning of it. But the angle, again, this is something I've spoken about in the past, and it may seem like a boring topic to some, but I want to, focus on a unique angle, which I think is going to be interesting, is that it's a silent revolution. And I use the words the silent revolution based on a book by an Israeli researcher, actually, ironically, Gur al-Ro'i, and his book in Hebrew, obviously, Hamapecha Shkita, and there's obviously tons more material in English on this topic. There's books and books and books about the Great Immigration. The latest one I read happened to have been this one, and he had a unique perspective on it. And it's the silent revolution, because this is a revolution without war, without violence, without a political platform, without a class struggle or anything like that. And it's not much of an ideology either. And it's a grassroots revolution. It's done by the masses. And it's not, directed or engineered or socially engineered in any way from above. It's completely from bottom up. And that's what makes it so unique, and that's what I'm going to elaborate on. Now, there's all kinds of aspects of immigration that are not covered in many of the main books and a lot of literature on the topic, or when we talk about the topic. There's internal migration, when Jews moved from place to place. During that time, I'm talking about during the late 19th century, early 20th century, and that's the focus of the time is on immigration. Internal migration means moving from place to place in the same country. In Russia, for instance, moving to bigger cities. There's the urbanization is a form of migration. In the United States, you had that also. You had what they call the second generation migration, was from the cities to suburbia, right? The post-war, after World War II, or from New York and Chicago to Miami and LA, also the product of the 1950s. So there's this internal migration that exists. There's urbanization, which I mentioned. There's immigration to more obscure places around the world. Meaning we talk primarily about the immigration to the United States because that was 90% of the Jewish immigration, and we can mention a few other countries as well. And like there's to England and to Western Europe and to Canada, Australia, and South Africa, and to the land of Israel, of course. That's also part of the story as well. But there's even to some more obscure places. There's to the Far East, to the city of Harbin in China, or to Shanghai. And way before the Polish refugees there, among them the Mir Yeshiva, arrived there in World War II, there's already from Russia during the time of the Great Immigration. In the early 1900s, there's several thousand Russian Jews who don't go to New York, they go to Shanghai, China. And they're there for 40 years before the Polish refugees come at the beginning of World War II. So there's these more obscure places of immigration as well, which makes it more interesting. There's immigration we spoke about from Russia, from Eastern Europe. That's the main story. But what about the immigration from countries of origin that aren't the usual ones on the list, from countries in North Africa and the Middle East, from Morocco to Yemen? There are Jews migrating from those countries as well. And how does it happen that it's at the same exact time that Jews are moving from Russia? Obviously, it's a greater scale from Russia because there's more Jews there. But it's an interesting, because everyone's on the move, it seems. Not only that, but it's the greater context of immigration to the United States during that time by the world, by the general population, non-Jews. It's Asians, Italians, especially Italians, Irish, Germans, Poles, and anyone else who during this era of unrestricted immigration to the United States. So the Jews are just a small drop in the bucket of the millions and millions of general immigrants, of non-Jewish immigrants that are coming to the country at the time, and therefore it's worth examining in the greater context as well. Now, I had several previous episodes of that discussed immigration. So I spoke about it on quite some time ago, a couple of years ago. One of the earliest episodes in the Jewish History Soundbites was called "Streets Paved with Gold: The Mass Wave of Jewish Immigration." I mentioned it also on the Houston episode because of the Galveston Plan. I mentioned it also on the railroad episode because the railroad was the technological advancement that allowed the immigration to happen. I mentioned the immigration to the land of Israel on the 5 Aliyot episode. On the commemorative 250th episode, I discussed immigration as one of the major catalysts of change in the Jewish history of the modern era. So I have discussed different angles of it in the past, but I'm going to try to give a fresh perspective of it in this one here. In the full disclosure, obviously, this is one of my favorite topics, so you'll bear with me. And it's the reason that I'm coming back to it now is because of what I mentioned before, that this is the silent revolution. That's why it's so important. That was the main point of this Gural Roi's book, one of the greatest books I've ever read. It's a fantastic book. There's no leadership to this revolution. That's why is it silent? There's no organization. It's not organized. There's no infrastructure. There's no platform. There's no group decision to go embark on this immigration. There's no political party involved. There's almost no media. There's a little bit of media. We'll talk about that also. There's basically no ideology, drop of ideology, drop of media, but mostly, like I said, no leadership. In fact, the leadership of all stripes, not only religious, was for the most part against it. And yet, these rank and file individuals, with their individual decisions, created a far greater revolution in Jewish history and among the Jewish people than any other change of the last few centuries. Its impact on the Jewish world of today it's transformative. It completely changed the Jewish world. And this is the major theme and story, and I can't overemphasize it. And it really brings us to another topic. It opens up another, fun topic to discuss about whether history is deterministic or can it be channeled or led by individuals or leaders. And it's a debate among historians. There are those of the opinion that we need to focus on the biographies of heroes, of big people, because they're the ones who make change, who generate change, who, through their leadership skills and through their ideas. I remember hearing a lecture from Professor Emanuel Etkes defending this position because he spent his entire academic career profiling these type of people. The Baal Shem Tov he wrote on the Vilna Gaon, or Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, on the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya. He focused on biographies of these great people, leaders, and he felt that that's what creates history, creates change. That's one position, and I have to admit that I used to be more on that side of the equation. I used to subscribe to that position. Or the other argument is, no, it's the circumstances of history, it's the context, it's the events, it's the big picture, which provides a platform for history's players to operate, but individuals rarely actually shape history or events itself. And that's where I've, more leaning towards in the last few years. And it's a legitimate and endless debate. And I got to say that this topic is in the process of, converting me from the bio, leader, hero-based version of history to a more deterministic view of history. And this story of immigration is the big push. This is where you see it in its most profound sense. It's a profound story. Not only were there no leaders or organization or anything else in this endeavor, but for the most part, the leadership was against it for various different reasons. The Russian government, which is a form of leadership, they weren't fundamentally against it, but they put plenty of blocks in the way. The Jewish leadership, the Jewish financial elite and somewhat secular elite in St. Petersburg was against it because they wanted everyone to be loyal Russian citizens and they should integrate into Russian society. The socialists were against it because you're just running away from the problem. You have to create a revolution for workers in the country. The religious rabbis were primarily against it. There were some important exceptions, actually, to rabbis who were not against it, but that's another story. But they were against it because they were afraid of secularization. The Zionists were against it because they wanted, if there is any immigration, it should go to a specific place. And all this opposition from all the various different leadership, nothing worked. The masses decided on its own what's best for it, and that's what ultimately created the reality, nothing else. And if that's not convincing of a deterministic view of history, then I don't know what is. And this made the most important and largest impact on the Jewish world as we know it today. More than any other of the other revolutions or changes which were discussed by the Jewish people in the modern era. By the time the Great Immigration was done in 1925, the Jewish people were completely transformed from what they had been before it began a half a century earlier. They were now the largest Jewish community in the world was now the United States. It had been almost a non-existent community in 1875, besides for the German Jewish immigration, which I mentioned in the last episode. But it was basically non-existent. It was brand new. And then by the time the Great Immigration is over, it's the largest Jewish community in the world. And it changes the Jewish map forever. And especially with hindsight, with the post-war, that becomes the basis. Immigration to Israel, which is the story of immigration from the 5 Aliyot, which is during the time of the Great Immigration, creates the basis of these two of the largest Jewish communities today, to Israel and the United States. When I say determinism, and I've used the phrase a few times, it's like has a bad connotation. It's used in a Marxist context sometimes. The deterministic view of history in Marxism, the party, the leadership, the interpretation of the show trials during the great purges of the old Bolsheviks was to say, well, they have to have been guilty because they were on trial, and if Stalin was right, then Nikolai Bukharin must be wrong because history is deterministic and history decides everything. And there's an old Soviet saying, "The future is certain; it's the past that's unknown." In the Orwellian sense, right? The past can be changed at will, right? You can decide whatever's convenient for now. But the future is certain because of determinism. I don't mean it exactly in that way. What I mean it is that it's created on the ground. There are these processes that are irreversible. They may be long processes, and they start from the grassroots. They start on the ground, and they just happen. Now, furthermore, the Jews faced crisis in the 19th century, especially in Eastern Europe. Russia is the largest Jewish community in the world in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and all the way up to World War I. And it's 5 million Jews living in Russia. It's the largest in the world by a lot, the largest Jewish community, and they're facing crisis not only in Russia but in many other places as well. There's a demographic explosion of the population, economic crisis, political questions of emancipation, not receiving equal rights, emancipation not achieving its goals by there still being modern anti-Semitism. There's religious crisis with the secularization of the Jewish people in Europe and beyond. There's educational issues. There's nationalism, emancipation, language, cultural. It's existential questions about the Jewish future and Jewish identity in the modern era were constantly discussed in the pages of the growing Jewish press towards the end of the 19th century, in the pages of HaMelitz and HaShachar and HaMagid and HaKarmel and HaLevanon, the religious newspaper, or Hatzvira, other papers, many others in other languages as well. And everyone's asking, again, these are Jewish journalists in the Jewish press, what's the solution to the Jewish question? In retrospect, this question has very ominous and tragic connotations because Hitler decided to embark on a final solution. But 100 years earlier, in the 19th century, the Jews and Jewish leadership across the spectrum of Jewish life, religious, secular, everything in between, were asking the question about the future of the Jewish people in light of the challenges they were confronted with in the 19th century. What's going to be the solution? What is the future of the Jewish people, religiously, politically, economically, culturally? What is Jewish identity? How is the Jewish community going to look? And the number of solutions proposed by writers, thinkers, political leaders, religious leaders, political parties, editors, organizations, revolutionaries, and so on are so numerous that it would take all day just to enumerate and analyze the pros and cons of each one. But the point I want to make is this. None of them really worked out that well. And none of them provided a mass solution that a significant percentage of the Jewish world adopted. All except one, immigration. And this was the only one that was not promoted by leaders and was rather a silent revolution implemented by the masses on their own initiative. Now, whether one likes or dislikes immigration, and many people dislike it because it caused assimilation, it caused secularization, it doesn't make a difference whether one likes it or not. It's a reality. It happened. It's a historical reality, and it came about in this fashion. So one may have opinions about it, but it's definitely, from a historical perspective, it's a reality that one has to confront and recognize how it came about. So one can say with a pretty convincing argument and an element of confidence that where all others failed, or at least weren't all that very successful, the solution of the masses, without organization and without leadership, was the one that was wildly successful. And that's a fantastic story. It is a story of individuals, mostly anonymous ones, very often courageous, and almost always rank and file, anonymous people who made it happen. So another thing I would like to give it some more context and also to focus on the immigration process itself. Although I mentioned that it goes from the 1870s to 1924, but the decade prior to World War I is the main decade where it intensifies. So that's the main story is the of immigration is that last decade from 1904 to 1914. It's a flood of immigrants that was unmatched in the 30 years before, or really after the war, because after World War I it slowed down, and then it came to a stop with the Johnson-Reed Act in Congress in 1924. So World War I itself obviously cuts everything off because shipping, borders, shipping companies, everything stopped then. Now, one of the interesting things about the immigration is that everyone likes to say, well, most of the Jews came from Russia, and in Russia there were pogroms. So A plus B equals C. We can definitely, correlation obviously is causal also. We know, of course, that correlation does not mean causal. You have to prove cause. But so there is correlation. It's a partial cause. But here's where it gets difficult. It can't only be because of pogroms, for several reasons, and I'll just point out the most obvious one. At the same time, there was this mass Jewish migration from Russia. There was at the same time in other areas of Eastern Europe, give two examples, Galicia, which is in the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Romania, which is an independent country, there was probably the same level of immigration, of Jewish immigration. In other words, Jews were leaving Galicia and Romania during the same exact years and at the same pace as their Russian brethren in the Tsarist Russian Empire. Now, in Galicia, there were no pogroms. In Romania, there was plenty of anti-Semitism, but no pogroms. Galicia, there wasn't even that much anti-Semitism under the Habsburgs at that point. It was a bit enlightened. And they're leaving at the same time. So if it was because of the pogroms, then why would they be leaving so much from Galicia and Romania? So there has to be other reasons as well. And as we'll see, it was mostly economic. Now, in order to understand why this was even possible, why it was possible, in order for to anyone who's been an immigrant or knows an immigrant, I happen to have been an immigrant, so I know exactly what it is. But the idea of an immigrant, to pick oneself up and move to another country, to a new world, is a difficult process. So why would someone do that? And why would millions of people do it? So there was a confluence of three things that created the possibility of the Great Immigration. And those three things coming together, as far as I know, has never repeated itself in world history. And that's why the Great Immigration was possible. And remember, there's millions of non-Jews coming at the same time. So these three things are kind of relevant for everyone, not just for Jews, but the Jewish people in Europe utilized this opportunity to its fullest. Number one, there were millions of people who wished to leave their country of origin. And we'll see why. Like I said, mainly economic reasons, but also anti-Semitism and pogroms, and they play a role as well. And of course, the military draft, which was a relatively new thing as well. And there's all these things that are good. Probably one of the biggest reasons, demographic explosion. The 19th century Europe saw a demographic explosion. There's a huge spike. You got to look at the graphs to see the spike in growth of the human population. Jewish population grew at an even faster rate, actually, for a bunch of different reasons, which I'm not going to get into either. But so now there's this, all these mouths to feed, and there's not enough jobs, especially the Pale of Settlement, where they're limited, where they can go, where they can live, where they can move, what businesses they can have. So there's millions of people who wish to leave their country of origin for a variety of reasons. That's one thing that exists. That doesn't always exist in human history. Number two, there was and this is usually overlooked because we usually look at the place of origin and the destination. What about the means to get there? So there's transportation, which made it relatively relatively easy to get there across the world, which didn't exist before. So you have new technology in shipping, steamships and ocean liners, a cheaper cost of buying tickets on these transatlantic voyages. The ports in Germany, Bremerhaven and Hamburg, which are the two main ports, and the shipping companies that left it, were modernized. Cheaper tickets, places to stay on the way, railroads with good scheduling and cheap tickets to get from Russia to Bremerhaven and Hamburg in Germany to the ports. Media, which is another advancement in technology, which was able to report things. Mail services, which enabled people to hear from relatives who had already moved. Yeah, come, we'll arrange things for you, we'll send you tickets, we'll help you get jobs. Newspapers are able to report on things. Information, the way that information is transmitted. So all these technological advances in shipping, in the ports, in the railroads, in media, in information, in mail, all that comes together to create the means of actually making the move, which again, this second point is usually overlooked. And the third point, which is the main reason why the three have never come together again in world history, is that there was a country, the United States, and to a lesser extent some other countries, who was willing and even desired, they wanted it, they actively wanted to absorb millions of immigrants seeking employment to develop its industry. Talking about at a time, this is a crossroads of American history, where there's huge new opportunities. The Industrial Revolution, a massive country that was underdeveloped for the most part, factories opening, the textile industry is booming, and they need workers. They have job potential for millions, and they need people to come. So they wanted people to come. There were such liberal immigration policy in the United States in those days that you did not need a passport to enter the United States. Russian Jews leaving Russia needed a passport to leave Russia. The Tsar didn't allow them to leave unless they had a passport, which they had to apply for and pay money for, and a whole story is part of the process as well. But to get into the United States, they did not need a passport. They needed a health check to make sure they're not bringing any disease in. They needed some minimal funds. You needed to show that you had some cash and a ship ticket. They wouldn't allow you on the ship without a ticket. You had a health check, minimal, very minimal amount of funds, just some money, some cash, and a ship ticket. You went in. You got into the United States. That's all you needed. You didn't need a visa. You didn't need a passport. You didn't need to schedule anything. You just walked in. And this window of opportunity existed, like I said, from 1870 to 1924, where all three of the above things came together and has never repeated itself since then. If you miss one of those three, the Great Immigration doesn't happen. Before 1870, the technology wasn't there. Number two, the transportation technology wasn't there. After 1924, number three was absent. There's no country that would allow millions of people to come in. Other times in world history, number one was absent. Not at every juncture in history are there millions of people who want to leave their places of origin. So the Jewish people, especially in Russia, they utilized this opportunity and rare window that it offered, and they utilized it to its fullest. Millions of Jews moved across the world during this time period. I got about a fifth of the way through my notes on immigration. So I hope to be able to return to this topic again and again and again and again here on this podcast until everyone's so bored of it that you tell me to stop. But not next episode. Some future time we'll get back to it. There's a lot of interesting angles that I still haven't touched upon yet. So this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.